In 1975, kids as young as 9 were legally working jobs that would land their bosses in prison today. These weren't under-the-table gigs. They were legitimate careers with paychecks and everything. But something changed that made these jobs so dangerous, society banned them completely. What were they hiding? Coal miners in the 1970s worked in conditions that would land mine owners in federal prison today. Black lung disease was as common as coffee breaks, yet companies treated dust control warnings like junk mail. Completely ignored. The numbers tell a grim story. Miners descended into shafts with nothing more than a helmet and a prayer. Dust clouds so thick you couldn't see your own boots. Just another Tuesday underground. Well, turns out breathing coal dust for decades does exactly what you'd expect. It kills you slowly. Companies knew this. They had the warnings, the studies, the whole 9 yards, but protective equipment cost money, and money was apparently more important than lungs. Makes sense, right? If you're a complete sociopath, then the government finally stepped in with regulations that had actual teeth. Suddenly, mine operators discovered they could afford proper ventilation systems after all. Funny how that works. By 2014, black lung cases had dropped dramatically thanks to stricter air quality standards. Modern mines now monitor dust levels constantly, provide real protective gear, and face massive penalties for cutting corners. But here's what gets really interesting. The 1970s had another job that was literally poisoning workers in the environment, yet people did it every single day without a second thought. Workers in the 70s handled pesticides like they were watering their garden. DDT? Spray it without gloves. Chlordane? Mix it with bare hands. The attitude was basically, if it kills bugs, it can't be that bad for humans. Which is like saying if soap cleans dishes, you might as well drink it. These jobs weren't just dangerous. They were downright ridiculous by today's standards. Farm workers would come home covered in chemical residue, their clothes stiff with toxins. Nobody thought twice about eating lunch right after spraying fields. Well, turns out chemicals don't take lunch breaks from being poisonous. The health problems started piling up faster than dirty laundry. Birth defects, cancer rates, neurological issues. The human body wasn't exactly thrilled about this chemical bath routine. Makes sense, right? By the late 70s, regulations finally caught up with common sense. Then there's the environmental impact nobody saw coming. Birds dropping dead, fish floating belly up, soil becoming sterile. Mother Nature was basically sending a very clear message that humanity had gone completely off the rails. Today's pesticide application requires extensive training, protective equipment, and licensing. Workers need hazmat suits for chemicals that 70s farmers handled in t-shirts. The transformation has been dramatic. But speaking of dramatic workplace changes, telephone operators faced an entirely different kind of extinction. Back in the 70s, being a telephone party line operator was like being the neighborhood's unofficial gossip coordinator. These folks managed shared phone lines where multiple households used the same connection. Sounds cozy, right? Well, it was about as private as announcing your business through a megaphone at the town square. Party line operators could listen in on conversations anytime they wanted. They knew who was dating whom, which families were fighting, and probably what everyone had for dinner. Nearly 80% of American households shared these lines, creating a privacy nightmare that would make today's data protection lawyers break out in cold sweats. The job seemed harmless enough then. Operators would connect calls, manage line traffic, and occasionally eavesdrop on Mrs. Henderson complaining about her arthritis. But here's where things get legally sticky. Those operators had unrestricted access to private conversations without any oversight or consent protocols. Modern telecommunications laws would shut this down faster than a broken elevator. Today's privacy regulations treat personal communications like classified government documents. Consumer protection standards now guarantee call privacy, making the old party line system completely illegal. The transformation happened gradually through the 80s as individual phone lines became standard. But wait until you hear about workers who handled something far more dangerous than private conversations. They were literally working with materials that could kill them decades later. Back in the 70s, asbestos was everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Insulation, floor tiles, ceiling materials, pipe wrapping. Workers grabbed chunks of this stuff with their bare hands like it was cotton candy at a county fair. The problem? Well, nobody told these folks they were essentially handling death in fiber form. Construction crews would rip out asbestos insulation without so much as a dust mask. They'd go home covered in the stuff, tracking it through their houses on work boots. Their families breathed it in too. Makes you wonder how many dinner tables became contamination zones, right? Here's the kicker. Companies knew asbestos caused lung problems as early as the 1930s. But they kept that little secret locked up tighter than their executive washrooms. Workers kept handling it like harmless cotton batting until the late 70s when lawsuits started flying. Then there's mesothelioma, a cancer so nasty it's basically asbestos' calling card. By the 1980s, thousands of workers were getting diagnosed. The stuff was like a time bomb with a 20 to 40-year fuse. Today, you need a hazmat suit, special training, and government certification just to look at asbestos wrong. But speaking of jobs that required zero qualifications back then, back in the 70s, you could literally walk onto a demolition site and start swinging a sledgehammer without anyone asking for paperwork. Wild, right? These unlicensed demolition workers handled everything from heavy machinery to actual explosives, and nobody checked if they knew what they were doing. Well, turns out letting someone play with dynamite because they looked strong enough wasn't the brightest idea. It was like handing your car keys to someone who'd only seen driving in movies. Sure, they might figure it out, but do you really want to find out the hard way? The accident rates were absolutely bonkers. Workers got crushed by falling debris, blown up by improperly handled explosives, or buried under collapsing structures. Makes sense when you think about it. Demolition is basically controlled destruction, and these guys were about as controlled as a toddler with finger paints. Then the 80s rolled around, and OSHA finally said, enough is enough. Suddenly, you needed actual training, certifications, and safety oversight. Demolition fatalities dropped like a rock, pun intended. Today's demolition crews need engineers, safety officers, and workers who actually know which end of the explosive goes boom. But here's something that might surprise you about another 70s job that put kids in serious danger. Schools in the 1970s were basically lead paint galleries disguised as learning centers. Workers slapped this toxic coating on classroom walls like they were frosting a birthday cake. Except this frosting could permanently damage developing brains. These paint crews had zero clue they were creating poison palaces for children. Lead paint looked great, lasted forever, and nobody questioned why little Timmy suddenly couldn't focus on his multiplication tables. The connection between lead exposure and cognitive problems? Well, that light bulb took decades to flicker on. But here's the kicker. Even when health concerns started surfacing, many schools kept hiring painters who used lead-based products simply because it was cheaper. Like choosing expired milk because it's on sale, the logic was financially sound, but absolutely disastrous health-wise. Workers would sand old lead paint without masks, creating toxic dust clouds that settled everywhere. Kids breathing this stuff daily suffered learning disabilities, behavioral issues, and developmental delays that lasted lifetimes. The government finally stepped in during the late 70s, banning lead paint in schools and requiring special certification for removal work. Today's lead abatement specialists wear hazmat suits and follow strict protocols that would make a surgeon jealous. Speaking of jobs that put people in harm's way, cemetery workers face their own set of unregulated dangers that might surprise you. Back in the 70s, digging graves was basically a free-for-all. No licenses, minimal oversight, and safety standards? Well, those were more like gentle suggestions that everyone ignored. Workers showed up with shovels and crossed their fingers that nothing would go wrong. The health risks were staggering. Contaminated soil, exposure to decomposing remains, and zero protective equipment meant grave diggers were walking disease magnets. It was like playing Russian roulette with bacteria, except every chamber was loaded. Many developed serious respiratory infections, skin conditions, and worse. Then there's the environmental nightmare nobody talks about. Improper burial depths, contaminated groundwater, and soil that became a biological hazard zone. These folks were essentially creating health disasters 6 feet underground while everyone looked the other way. Makes sense that regulations eventually stepped in, right? Today's cemetery workers need proper training, hazmat equipment, and follow strict protocols. The job transformed from a dangerous gamble into a regulated profession that actually protects both workers and the community. Modern grave preparation involves soil testing, proper depth measurements, and environmental assessments. Workers wear protective gear and follow sanitation procedures that would make a hospital proud. The infection rates plummeted once these standards kicked in during the 80s. But speaking of protecting people, let's talk about an industry that took decades longer to clean up its act. The entertainment industry in the 1970s treated child performers like tiny adults with zero protection. Kids worked 14-hour days on movie sets without tutors, proper breaks, or anyone monitoring their well-being. Makes sense, right? Well, not really. These children missed school for months, earned money they'd never see, and faced intense pressure that would break most grown-ups. Their parents often spent their earnings faster than a gambler at Vegas. Meanwhile, studios pushed these young stars to work through exhaustion, illness, and emotional breakdowns. The whole setup was like sending kindergartners to run a corporation. Completely backwards and harmful, child actors developed eating disorders, anxiety, and missed out on normal childhood experiences. Some never recovered from the psychological damage. Then there's the financial exploitation. Kids had no legal protection over their earnings. Parents and managers drained their bank accounts legally, leaving former child stars broke by 18. But everything changed when Congress stepped in during the late 70s and 80s. New laws demanded on-set tutoring, limited working hours, and protected earnings through trust funds. Health advocates pushed for psychological support and regular welfare checks. Today's child performers have agents specifically trained in child welfare law, mandatory education requirements, and financial protections their predecessors could only dream about. However, speaking of workplace dangers that seemed normal back then, nuclear plant workers faced. Working at nuclear plants in the 1970s was basically like playing Russian roulette with invisible bullets. Workers strolled around reactors wearing nothing more protective than their regular clothes and maybe a hard hat if they were lucky. The radiation exposure levels back then? Well, let's just say a banana probably offered better protection than most safety protocols. Guards routinely entered contaminated areas without dosimeters, those little devices that actually measure how much radiation you're soaking up. It's like swimming in shark-infested waters while wearing a blindfold and headphones. But here's the kicker. Many workers didn't even know they were being exposed to dangerous levels until years later when health problems started surfacing. The record keeping was about as reliable as a chocolate teapot. Companies often ignored federal guidelines, treating safety regulations like suggestions rather than life-saving requirements. Then, 3 Mile Island happened in '79, and suddenly everyone realized that nuclear safety wasn't just important, it was absolutely critical. The wake-up call was louder than a fire alarm in a library. Today's nuclear workers undergo extensive training, wear multiple layers of protection, and get monitored more closely than teenagers on their first date. The transformation has been remarkable, but it came at a serious cost. Speaking of jobs that needed serious oversight, air traffic control was another profession where a lack of proper standards created some truly hair-raising situations. Air traffic controllers in the 1970s? Well, let me tell you, it was like hiring someone to juggle flaming torches while blindfolded. These folks were managing dozens of planes without the psychological screening we consider absolutely essential today. Back then, you could literally walk into an airport tower with basic qualifications and start directing aircraft worth millions of dollars. No stress assessments, no mental health evaluations. Makes sense, right? What could possibly go wrong when someone's having a bad day and controlling metal tubes flying at 600 miles per hour? The job requirements were shockingly minimal compared to today's standards. Controllers worked insane hours without mandatory rest periods, often pulling double shifts when understaffed. Some worked 70 hours a week regularly. That's like asking your grandfather to referee a hockey game after staying awake for 3 days straight. Then there's the technology aspect, or lack thereof. Controllers relied on outdated radar systems and handwritten notes. One controller's illegible handwriting could literally cause disasters. The transformation didn't happen overnight, though. After several close calls and accidents, regulations finally caught up with reality. Today's controllers undergo rigorous psychological testing, continuous health monitoring, and mandatory rest periods. But speaking of dangerous working conditions, factory supervisors had their own set of problems that would make your head spin. Factory supervisors in the 1970s had one job nobody talks about anymore: looking the other way. While safety regulations existed on paper, these guys treated them like suggestions at a buffet. You could follow them or not. The result? Workers lost fingers, eyes, and sometimes their lives because supervisors figured productivity mattered more than people. It was like having a lifeguard who decided swimming lessons were optional while sharks circled the pool. These supervisors weren't just negligent, they were actively breaking laws that existed to protect workers. But enforcement was so weak, they got away with murder, literally in some cases. Then the 80s rolled around and everything changed. Enhanced employee rights meant workers could finally fight back without losing their jobs. Suddenly, supervisors who ignored safety protocols found themselves facing serious legal consequences. The numbers don't lie. Factory safety incidents dropped by 60% after regulations got teeth. Turns out when supervisors actually had to follow the rules, fewer people got hurt. Who would have thought? But here's the thing about workplace safety. It wasn't just about factory floors getting cleaned up. Some of the most dangerous work environments were hiding in plain sight, pumping toxic fumes into workers' lungs every single day. Breathing toxic fumes all day. That was just Tuesday for plastic manufacturing workers in the 1970s. These folks worked in facilities where proper ventilation was about as common as a unicorn in a parking lot. Companies figured, why spend money on fancy air systems when workers could just hold their breath, right? Well, not exactly, but the mentality wasn't far off. Workers melted, molded, and shaped plastics while chemical vapor swirled around them like a poisonous fog. The air quality was so bad you could practically chew it. Then there's the health disasters that followed. Respiratory problems became epidemic among these workers. Makes sense, right? When you're inhaling chemicals that belong in a laboratory, not your lungs, things go sideways fast. The weird part is how long this continued. Even when workers started getting sick, many companies treated ventilation systems like luxury items instead of basic necessities. It's like deciding umbrellas are optional during a hurricane. Technically possible, but spectacularly stupid. Today's plastic manufacturing facilities are required by law to maintain strict air quality standards. Regular monitoring, industrial-grade ventilation systems, and protective equipment are mandatory. The transformation has been remarkable. Respiratory illness rates among plastic workers dropped significantly once proper ventilation became legally required. But speaking of jobs that ignored worker safety, prison guards in the 1970s worked in a Wild West environment that would make today's corrections officers shake their heads in disbelief. No psychological evaluations, minimal training, and zero oversight on how they treated inmates. Guards could basically run their blocks however they wanted. Some were reasonable folks just trying to do their job. Others? Well, let's just say they treated prisoners like they were running their own personal kingdom, and nobody was watching. The training consisted of, here's your keys, don't let anyone escape. That's it. No classes on de-escalation, no lessons on constitutional rights, no guidance on proper use of force. Guards learned everything on the job from other guards who had learned everything on the job from... You get the picture. But here's where it gets really wild. There were virtually no records kept of incidents. A guard could rough up an inmate, and as long as nobody died, it often went unreported. Makes sense, right? Who was going to complain? The liability alone would bankrupt any prison system today. Modern corrections facilities require extensive training, psychological screening, and constant supervision. Every interaction gets documented. Cameras watch the watchers. Speaking of dangerous working conditions, wait until you hear about the janitors who were literally poisoning themselves every single day. Back in the 1970s, janitors and cleaning crews worked with chemicals that would make today's safety inspectors faint. We're talking about substances so toxic they could strip paint and your lung lining at the same time. These workers routinely used industrial solvents, ammonia-based cleaners, and bleach mixtures without proper ventilation or protective gear. Many didn't even know what they were handling. The chemical labels, often missing or completely useless. I remember my uncle telling stories about mopping floors with cleaners so strong they'd burn his throat for hours afterward. He thought that burning sensation meant the stuff was working. Well, it was working all right, working on destroying his respiratory system. The really wild part? Mixing different chemicals was common practice. Janitors would combine bleach with ammonia-based products, accidentally creating chloramine gas. That's basically chemical warfare in a supply closet. Then there's the cancer connection nobody talked about. Workers developed skin conditions, breathing problems, and worse. But companies kept buying the cheapest, harshest chemicals available because they cut through grime fast. Today's cleaning industry operates under strict regulations. Workers receive hazmat training, use eco-friendly products, and wear protective equipment. The old toxic cocktails are banned or heavily restricted. But speaking of dangerous workplace conditions, wait until you hear about the modeling industry's dark secrets from that same era. The modeling world of the 1970s? Well, it was a completely different beast. Models were basically expected to be walking skeletons with cheekbones sharp enough to cut glass. No regulations existed to protect these young people from the industry's toxic demands. Agencies pushed models to survive on lettuce and cigarettes. Literally. The phrase, "nothing tastes as good as skinny feels," wasn't just a motto. It was practically a job requirement. Like asking marathon runners to compete while holding their breath, the standards were medically insane. But here's where it gets legally murky. Many of these agencies actually required models to maintain specific measurements or face contract termination. Today, that's considered workplace discrimination and health endangerment in most places. The turning point came when eating disorder rates among models skyrocketed. By the early 2000s, several countries began implementing laws requiring minimum body mass indexes for runway models. France made it illegal to hire models below a certain weight threshold. Spain followed suit. Now, agencies face serious legal consequences for promoting unhealthy body standards. They're required to provide mental health resources and can't digitally alter photos without disclosure. The old heroin chic look, that'll land you in court faster than you can say size 0. Makes sense, right? Sometimes progress means making the obviously harmful stuff officially illegal.